Hello, welcome to Connie Martinson Talks Books. Did you ever have a girlfriend who was one person when she was with you, and the minute a man walked in the room, you didn't know whatever happened to your friend because she was a whole other person? Or a man who's relaxed with you and his boss walks in the room and suddenly, what happened to the person you loved? Well, who were they? My guest, Dr. James Masterson, has written the book, The Search for the Real Self, Unmasking the Personality Disorders of Our Age. It's published by the Free Press, and we will be back after a short pause with Dr. Masterson. Welcome back. We're talking with Dr. James Masterson, author of The Search for the Real Self, Unmasking the Personality Disorders of Our Age, published by Free Press. Welcome, Dr. Masterson. I think this book is so phenomenal because it pinpoints, it explains, and then it says to you, as a person, as the reader, figure out a little bit for yourself. As I defined what I saw as what a real self wasn't, what is a real self?
Okay, the real self is a part of the personality structure which is vital in helping you to make the decisions that will bring forth a life which is both meaningful and fulfilling, because it helps you to decide what relationships are right for yourself and what kind of work is right for yourself. And it emerges in early life between age 2 and 3 as the child separates his image of himself from the mother as he learns to walk. And his self becomes independent. And when that happens, there are certain capacities that come with it. To acknowledge yourself as being worthwhile, to be able to activate and assert yourself, to figure out what you want to do and experiment with it, to feel entitled to the kinds of pleasure and mastery that are involved in self-assertion, as well as to an environment that will provide that. Now, this is all more or less in place by age 3, and obviously it has to be experimented with and in the environment. And the rest of development is an experiment out there to find out what it is out there that fits this in here. And through adolescence and later young adulthood, as these choices are made that don't fit, they're discarded, and then a harmonious interrelationship is set up between what I call the real self and the relationships the person's in, as well as the kind of activity they're in.
In other words, no one escapes the feeling of abandonment as they are separating from the mother. There is
well,
the sense.
no, I don't think that in normal development it is necessary to feel abandonment. If there is adequate support for the emerging self, then there is a gradual and slow transfer of emotional investment from the mother and the image of the mother to the image of the self as the child practices his emerging curiosity. So no, there should not be any great sense of abandonment.
But, as you point out in the book, there are no perfect parents. There are no perfect situations. So there may be borderline, which is what this book is addressing in many ways. The borderline case of the woman who can't commit, or the man who can't commit to another person in intimacy, or who is in a job and everybody's always out of step, but they're right and they're the ones who leave. Some of these are the ills that arise from this stage.
Right.
Now, you use a case of a girl named Terry, who I must say had to be one enormously well-balanced, not normal, because it isn't that normal to be that well-balanced at such a young age, but was able to handle guilt from her parents, separation, a young man who threatens love and security because she's going off to veterinarian school, and strong enough to keep her own dedication to her own career. Does she exist?
Well, of course, it's a prototype that we invented in order to make these points. But I think that the fact that one can have that degree of self-confidence and self-capacity by age 4 is without question demonstrated by early child developmental studies. And now you're talking really about what is the normal personality. Now, we have other kind of studies of normal personalities, statistical studies of adolescents and adults, and they all more or less say the same thing, yes.
Yeah.
It comes as a surprise because we don't see it every day.
Well, some of the factors that came out with Terry was that others cannot refuel our own self-esteem.
One of the capacities that comes out, that emerges as the self becomes independent when it is supported, is first an image of yourself which is based on reality, who you really are, and one which also reinforces that image of yourself by the way you manage and master reality around you. Then there's a feedback. I managed that, I was okay, therefore I'm okay.
Okay.
And so this kind of system, feedback system, becomes autonomous and active after the age of 3. And
that your real self can soothe your own painful feelings. There is no magic outside to come in, no prince on a white charger.
You turn to yourself. I think it depends on what you've been exposed to, the trauma, but at the least what it does is reduce the amplitude of the swings of painful feelings and to find your own ways of limiting, rather than, as happens with many of our patients, what they do is they begin to have a painful state, and rather than try and soothe it, what they do is pour gas on it and light a match to it, which then makes the state worse.
That would be somebody who was an alcoholic, a bulimic, an anorexic, or foodaholic, or I suppose drugs. Dr. Masterson, we're going to take a short pause, and we'll be back with our guest, Dr. James Masterson, author of The Search for the Real Self, published by the Free Press. Welcome back. We're talking with Dr. James Masterson, author of Unmasking, The Search for the Real Self, Unmasking the Personality Disorders of Our Times. Dr. Masterson, in that list of a real self, or the healthy self who can handle life, there was the ability to make and stick to a commitment.
To commitments.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Of course, the biggest problem of people with personality disorders is they cannot do this. And in order to get a fulfillment out of self-expression, you have to make commitments and follow through on them.
And intimacy.
Which is the ultimate commitment.
Right.
And so, since they're unable to do this, because it brings out enormous fears of separation and of being depressed, what they have to do is they have to find ways of creating an illusion of a relationship while they're protecting themselves against a real relationship, which would stir up all those bad feelings. And this is where you have the woman who clings to the man who's inappropriate and putting her down for too long. This is where you have the man with Peter Pan. He cannot commit himself to a woman. So what he does is he has relationships, but as soon as the point comes to commit, he has to leave. And there are others who have it so badly, of course, that they are unable even to create an illusion of relationship and remain quite isolated.
When you said about the man who has, the illusion of perfection, you talk about a doctor in this book, and you warn also other therapists about that countertransference. Because here is this doctor who is, a God figure in his own world, but internally he has problems. There is no perfect woman.
Right.
And yet his analyst or therapist is feeding that.
Absolutely. I just saw another therapist just before I came out here, by the way, who had been with a therapist who fed this, and he became more and more narcissistic and demanding with his girlfriend, whom he was in love with, and she dropped him for that reason. And then he was furious and betrayed by his therapist, and so he quit the therapy.
Yeah.
But there's an interesting phenomenon, even in our field, about this. We're talking about the narcissistic disorder or the inflated self, who basically is unable to relate to others. He uses them as sources of adoration and adulation to make him feel better about himself. But in our field, because often he is able to function at work better than the borderline, who, however, is able to have relationships. We say that the borderline somehow is sicker than the narcissist,
Yeah.
which is a statement of our social point of view. What is more important, evidently, in our society is to work than to have relationships,
Yeah.
which I don't think is true. But
Well, that is the safety of living with your intellect as opposed to the emotions which know no age. The other part is the ability to be alone. And I had just read Solitude from...
Storr's book.
Yes. People are afraid of silence.
People, for example, let's take one side, the borderline type of patient. What happens with them as their self starts to emerge and it's not supported, and they experience depression and anger and fear of separation? They give up further investment in the real self. And then what they turn to in order to maintain a sense of self is others. And so they cling to others, and they cling to others' approval in order to feel good about themselves. For example, one of my patients would phrase it this way: I don't do what I want because my idea of what I want is filtered through what I think other people want. The way I think, the way I work, the way I dress, the way I relate to women, the way I do my recreational style. I am a master at figuring out what other people want and giving it to them. I am like a chameleon who takes on the colors of any environment that I'm in. But I think what's wrong is my lifestyle, and so I change it. But it doesn't work, because what's wrong is not what I'm doing, but why I'm doing it. I am not doing it for myself. I am doing it to please the others. And what I feel inside is trapped inside my skin, phony and inauthentic, and trying to get out.
As a result of all of those ills, you talk about an unresolved anger, an undifferentiated anger that then will manifest itself for something that it isn't called for.
Once the self has not been supported, all kinds of painful feelings arise. Anger, a prominent one, and depression, and anxiety. And they're all buried and kept under wraps and containment by this false self kind of defense, whether it's a deflated one or an inflated one. Then what tends to happen is later in life they're exposed, let's say they lose a parent or they lose a relationship, and out comes all this anger and depression that had been held in. It also comes out in relationships. Where
you say that what happens at that stage is repeated later in life within an emotional relationship.
As they attempt to form a relationship, the same anxiety, the same anger and depression arise if it were to be a real relationship. Since they haven't separated, they can't form the real relationship. So what they tend to do is to repeat an old defensive relationship in which they expect the other person not to relate to them in a real way, but to reinforce their defenses. For example, the man I just described, if he had a relationship with a woman, he would expect her to provide a lot of feedback so that he could fulfill it and thereby maintain some sense of self, false though it may be. The other one, with the inflated sense of self, he has to find a mate who adores him and adulates him and thinks that he's perfect. This reinforces his inflated sense of self.
Or as a doctor I once knew said, it doesn't matter what the other person does or doesn't do. How do you really feel about it? Dr. Masterson, we're going to take a short pause. We'll be back with Dr. James Masterson, author of Search for the Real Self. Welcome back. We're talking with Dr. James Masterson, author of The Search for the Real Self, Unmasking the Personality Disorders of Our Age, published by Free Press. Dr. Masterson, you have a statement that any separation can trigger the original abandonment dynamic. And in that case, you talk about the trauma of the first year of college.
There are any number of nodal points in the life, I call them nodal points in the life cycle, which expose the developing person, first of all, to more separation from the original object, the mother, as well as greater requirements for individuation to handle. And it starts when they leave the local school to go to the junior high school. Do you remember Philip Roth's book, Portnoy's Complaint?
Yes, yes.
A wonderful opening paragraph. He says that when he was in school, he thought his mother was his teacher in disguise. So when he came home for lunch, he would beat it home as fast as he could to see if he could catch her before she changed her clothes, but he never made it.
I love that,
so
yes.
It's an example of the kind of symbiotic relatedness that occurs at that age. But so the first one is going to junior high school, and then high school, and then leaving high school to college. So each one of these can be a precipitating stress, interrupting all these defenses and bringing on this underlying depression, because they have to manage more on their own without the object to reinforce it. And they're exposed to more separation. So we see these kids coming in at certain ages.
You talk about in the book being a doctor for hospitalized adolescents, and that those who had some form of a cured because of an external authority figure, and that this was the hardest to maintain when they left the hospital, their need for external authority.
Well, not exactly. The ones who were cured, it was not through, there had to be an authority in order to set limits to their behavior, most of which was defensive. They would come into the hospital with all kinds of self-destructive behavior, and the purpose of the authority was to set limits to that in order to get them to experience their depression so it could be worked through. Those in whom it was successful, the working through relieves the anchor of that depression on the development of their real self. So the real self then developed, and they were able to leave and go on with their life. There were certain, we followed them up 7 to 8 years after we treated them. What we found was those who could not do that well. They did all right in the hospital, but they couldn't maintain it when they left. They were not able, even when the anchor was removed, to allow the real self to emerge, which made us think that they maybe did not have a genetic capacity for it, no matter what anybody did. But the hospital provided a protective structure, and they would then require in their lives a protective structure in order to manage.
We are living in an age that has been called the me generation, the narcissistic age. Is that all bad? And is it due to a mother who's been cold and unfeeling?
Well, I think the pendulum, the revolution of the 60s, I think despite our freedom from, our freedom as a democratic ideal and our freeing ourselves from the rule of the ancient British kings, our society was quite authoritarian in its attitude towards development, towards law, towards male-female relationships. So I think the revolution of the 60s accomplished an awful lot in changing this from an authoritarian society to a more individualistic society. And then, as what always happens, the pendulum swang too far towards a narcissistic society, where the only thing that's important is me. And of course, this has great risks, I think, for our society. And I think we see some of them, in action.
Within that chapter on narcissism, you talk about mirroring. And I laughed as I read it because there was a book on how to make a man love you, and it was called One Should Mirror Him, wear the same look clothes, talk the way, almost lose yourself and become his doppelganger.
Must have been a borderline woman who wrote that book, because this is the way they would operate. You see, and you see so many problematic marriages are narcissistic men and borderline women.
Yeah.
Because they have what looks like a fit, but it's a fantasy fit. And of course, my advice would be not to do that, because what would happen is that as you were doing this with him, he would feel, I've had several examples of this, he would feel wonderful about himself, and you, because you were making him feel so good about himself. But he wants it all the time, perfectly, and you can't do it. And when you fail, the person who is at fault is you, not him. For example, I had a man, this happens in treatment too.
Yeah. And
I had a man in treatment who I was trying to point out to him that a lot of his disappointments in me had to do with his need for me to mirror him perfectly. And in the course of this, he fell in love. This woman did the most beautiful job, like you just described, on him you can imagine. And so he was feeling wonderful. And then what happened? Unfortunately, she fell in love with him. A love relationship is a real relationship. And all of these narcissistic fantasies of his began to be exploded. And so now he's beginning to say, you know, I used to think she was so wonderful, but she's changed. There's something wrong with her. Yeah. And this gave me a wonderful opportunity to say, I'm sorry, there is nothing wrong with her. It's what's wrong with you. You're going through with her what you go through with me. If you're not fed in exactly this way, you feel so terribly disappointed and upset that you have to put it on the other person and not see that it's in you.
Are you a Freudian, Dr. Masterson?
I'm not a classical Freudian, no.
Yeah.
But it's a curious question, because as I see it, what has happened, Freud is the one who originated all of this work that has one-to-one psychotherapy. And now we have 88 different kinds, all of whom have co-opted part of Freud, and then they all get rid of Freud. The basic background for my understanding is Freudian, but I think it then goes on, and we call it object relations, developmental object relations theory, which, by the way, is in the last 20 years, as I see it, has been an astonishing advance in our field, I think comparable to what we're doing in outer space in terms of people's welfare, but it has not gotten the press that it really deserves. Because we are now able to do things for people we couldn't do 20 years ago.
Such as?
Such as these patients I describe in the book, and nobody knows better than me.
Yeah.
Because when I first came out of training, I treated this man, and I thought he had anxiety hysteria. And he got a little better after about 18 months, and he stopped treatment. But when I learned about all this, I felt so sad because I thought he was the one who got away.
Yeah.
He's now 40 years of age. He comes back to see me. I am delighted. What has happened in the interim? He has divorced 2 wives. He's paying alimony to 2 wives. He's going with a 3rd woman, and she wants to get married. And he says to me, I can't possibly pay alimony to a 3rd woman, so I think I better come back for treatment.
Yeah.
So I agreed with him. And then we did the treatment. He was a borderline personality, and we did it on that basis. And the difference in the improvement was like night and day.
That's remarkable. You mentioned a woman named Dr. Margaret Mahler. And I had not heard the name. And as I'm reading the book, it is What Went Right. And I thought, so often you're told what went wrong. She has been looking at what went right.
Absolutely. And that's one of the other dramatic changes in our field, which has not gotten across. That is not, most of our data was based on what patients told us from the past. Now what we've had, with Margaret Mahler, and she's not the only one, others, microscopic studies of children, normal mothers and children, as they go through these early stages. And so now we're able to make equations between what goes through the early stages and what we're seeing, and what our patients are telling us about what happened to them.
What about the fact that you mentioned, too, when you talk about the narcissistic and the clinging and the abandonment, usually there's a generational history that the mother clings to the child who clings to the next child, and where do you break that? It's not genetic, but it is in the history. It might as well be.
Yes, we have, for example, our adolescent unit, we have on occasion treated 3 generations, grandmother, mother, and daughter.
I'm laughing as I've read the book. I called my mother and I called my daughter. Right, yes.
Well, you ought to, I mean, if you can just break, as usual, if you can break it at one stage, you know, you can keep that person from duplicating it with their children.
And of course, as I read this chapter on narcissism, all I could think of was Mommy Dearest.
Of course.
That as long as the child is perfect and fits the mold, it's really the good mother, the bad mother, the wicked witch, as you point out, when the kid starts to no longer be an extension.
Absolutely. Story of this is a true story. A friend of mine. If the person is a narcissist and life or reality has rewarded him, he's very difficult to treat because obviously it's all justified. Yeah. Anyway, this friend of mine was referred a man who had won the Pulitzer Prize, or the Nobel Peace Prize, and he was kind of worried about how he was going to treat this man who was so famous and so forth. So he starts the treatment, and as so often happens in treatment, life never cooperates. The therapist was going on vacation, a separation stress, and so he was worried about how his patient was going to react. So he told him about it, and the patient didn't say anything for a while, but about 2 weeks before the therapist was to go on vacation, the patient says to him, you know, Doc, I've been thinking about what you told me. You're going on vacation, and I'm really worried. He said, I'm worried about you because I know your sessions with me are the best part of the week, and I don't know what you're going to do without them.
Dr. Masterson, thank you very much. As I said, I spoke to my mother, I spoke to my daughter, and maybe we'll all be a little healthier because of the book. Meanwhile, if anyone is out there who's postponing living, postponing making a commitment, and living with the depression that seems to have no answer, this book will give them some insight and a great deal of health. Will you autograph my book for me? If you'd like a copy of our publication, Good Books, write to me, Connie Martinson, P.O. Box 69, 1640. Look for our column in Beverly Hills Today, all of the California Press Bureau newspapers. We'll tell you about some other books we've liked recently, including Michael Leahy's Hard Lessons, Senior Years at Beverly Hills High School. Here are young people who have been abandoned in many ways, divorced families, a boy living with mothers who are dating and girls living with fathers who are dating, and nobody's an adult. These children are also put through the exams to get into, if you don't make Harvard or Yale or Smith or Wellesley, the rest of your life is failure. They are put into a pressure cabin and situation of stress that no young people should be in. And in the midst of all wealth and absolute material benefits, what will the next generation they produce be like? Very interesting nonfiction book, but reads like fiction. Breaking the Bank, The Decline of Bank America, Gary Hector's wonderful book about Giannini's bank that was built for the little man, the average person, and what happens to really a monolith when it is driven by egos that must invest big amounts in bad debts in third world countries. It is also another drama of one group changing, audits being done on people because they've spent $40 extra, almost an FBI, CIA within a conglomerate. Fascinating book. And Gary Hector is one of the associate editors of Fortune magazine. Meanwhile, support your local library. Go in, look up some other books on psychology, on healing, and also an organization called Reading is Fundamental, which helps children learn to read. And may you all be in psychic good health, and we'll see you next week. Thank you very much, Doctor.